Welcome to Reading and Writing Between the Lines, a podcast series about communication skills in the workplace. I'm your host, John Witzman. Join me as I speak with industry professionals and Conestoga faculty and alumni to explore their journeys with reading and writing skills. Follow us as we talk about how communications learning has changed over the years, how these skills are used in a wide range of industries, and the future of workplace communications. And hello, welcome to Reading and Writing Between the Lines. I'm here today with Chef Dan McCowan, chef owner at Red House Restaurant in Waterloo and executive chef at Conestoga's Bloom Restaurant. Welcome, Dan.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. We're going to have a conversation about how you use communication skills in your current working life. But before we do, could you just sort of briefly tell us what your job entails right now, being chef owner of a restaurant and executive chef at Bloom, and then we'll start to work our way in.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So I've had Red House. It'll be 11 years coming this April. So that's something that's been sort of almost like a life's work project. You know, my career when I opened that place was to kind of get my own take on a restaurant and have full control from the top down. And then most recently, over the course of the last year or so, taking on the executive chef role at the college. Obviously a very different environment, but been a great opportunity for my own personal growth, as well as to, 11 years of doing the same restaurant. It's allowed me to sort of take a step back there and allow that to kind of grow into its own entity, managing a team over there, as well as continuing to develop my own career.
Terrific. Thank you. That sounds like there's lots for us to dive into in terms of how you use communication skills throughout all of that work. And before we dive into the present, I was hoping that you could go into the past with me just a little bit to share with us what your early experiences were like when you were learning reading and writing communication skills in school. Was that historically space where you felt comfortable? Did it take some time for you to click in with that? What was that like? Ironically enough, for someone who ended up working with my hands in a very artistic, skilled thing, I was always very intrigued at a young age with reading and writing. I learned to read very, very young. Used to read a lot of books. Would write short stories when I was a little kid and stuff like that, and was really into that. And then as I sort of grew older, kind of got more into playing a bit of sports and kind of got away from it, but it was always sort of in the background there, that kind of side of things. Do you remember when you went away from it, when you were playing sports, did you get the sense that the people you were spending time with in sports, that they didn't view this sort of world as being positive? That did you feel like you kind of had to hide that a little bit for the space that you were in because you sensed that it wasn't cool in that domain?
Yeah, that's sort of one way you could look at it. I think it was in general just more of in those like high school years, you're very much into that camaraderie and a lot of friends. So doing the team games and stuff like that kind of took precedent and was just a lot of fun. Sure. Reading and writing and can be an exercise with within yourself kind of thing. So I think that it's definitely a balance, but I think that's what kind of intrigued me in those teenage years.
You mentioned that it was ironic, perhaps, that you had that connection with reading and writing when you were younger because you've gone on to have this career that is artistic and also, so tactile. And I think you're right. I think probably going into asking you that question, I had assumed perhaps the standard story was that you found your way to food, perhaps because, words on a page didn't click for you. When you were younger, did you feel the sense that there were sort of pathways lined up? I like reading and writing, therefore, my career path is going to take me this way. And I can see over there some people who don't seem to get that same satisfaction from this, part of class, and they're going to go on a different path.
Yeah, I could see that kind of logic to the thinking. I think as much as I was into the reading and writing, I think artistic side of things was what fed that. So, reading like, fiction stories or whatever it may be, kind of intrigued me, but always liked, I played music at a young age. I, always used to like draw as well. So I think the reason I ended up in cooking in particular wasn't necessarily because it was hands-on and away from reading, but it did offer that artistic side of things, but also like steady work, which some things in the arts don't really line up that way.
It's really cool that you were able to see at a young age the connections between things. It's I think an unfortunate feature of our system that we tend to compartmentalize subjects and skill sets, and I think probably more now than ever, there are efforts at every level of education to try to build that interdisciplinary focus or transdisciplinary focus, where people are seeing or young people are being invited to combine their skills and see how they work together. Do you recall ever time maybe when you started to get older, secondary or even post-secondary, where you started to see some of that blending together for you? Say, do you recall starting to read about food or write about food in a way that started to sort of combine those things for you?
Yeah, I think one thing that's will be extremely relatable is in those high school years, like I said, kind of deviating, spending a lot of time just more like with friends and social things. Like when it got near the tail end of high school, really had no direction on which way to take anything, what I wanted to go. So you start to look at your skill sets and thinking, oh, like, maybe writing and that would be good for me. But I always worked in restaurants as part-time jobs. So a friend of mine had owned, like his family owned a little fish and chips restaurant. Me and my friends all worked part-time there. And then when a couple of my friends went off to university, I thought to take journalism.
Oh, wow.
Because it was in writing and that had been a skill set of mine, whilst also working at a restaurant part-time. So after doing one full semester of the journalism, I realized I'm more leaning towards enjoying the cooking. I think I'm going to take some time and just focus on that, go to school for cooking. But my whole logic was to kind of do that while I figured out what I wanted to do. And then kind of for me, the rest is history, because I kept doing, better and better and sort of started seeing some positive results in the in that industry. And then, never left.
This is, I think, a great opportunity for us to sort of move forward into your working life. I'm really curious to know what role, if any, those you see that sort of reading and writing background and that reading and writing and communicating skill set. What role, if any, did that play in that early stage of your culinary career when, as you just said, you started to do well and you started to really connect and started to see your career blossoming? I'm sure, obviously, the majority of that success was built on your skills in the kitchen. But to what extent do you think that reading and writing skill set helped you at that stage of your career when you were developing?
Well, I think you're definitely right in assuming like those early stages, like working in something like cooking, you're more of a soldier down in the bottom. Right. They're putting you in the trenches. You're kind of working service. You're not expected to do much other than know the menu and what parts of the menu you're responsible for. But even something as simple as acknowledging that and recognizing this part of the menu is what I'm responsible for, and reading it out and understanding what they're trying to do. What's the chef trying to do with this dish? And actually having some comprehension there, as opposed to just saying, I don't know, I'm putting artichokes on a salad, whatever. It's not, you know what I mean? So being able to articulate and then learning those things is what allowed me to sort of excelling at a young age once I had some experience actually with the cooking process.
See, that's really interesting what you just shared to me, because it makes me think of a skill set that we're often talking about as educators in the communications subject, and it's a hard one to define, and it's a hard one to sort of tease out. But we tend to call it critical thinking, right? That idea that you could have a kind of inner voice that is describing in real time what you're seeing, what the information is that's coming in, whether it's from a written text or, in this case, from a workplace situation. And that inner voice can ask questions about what's going on, and it can sort of intentionally connect dots and draw conclusions. And in a way, it sounds almost like that conversation going on in your mind sort of spread out over, the spread out over time, making that insight, forming that insight that you just shared about, what's my role, what's my part in the bigger system here that is the kitchen and is the restaurant. That it's not that different from, on a smaller scale, somebody reading an article or reading a book and or reading a textbook chapter and using that critical thinking skill set to be able to say, okay, what am I on? What am I reading about on this page? How does this page fit into this chapter? How does this chapter fit into this overall book? What's its thesis or what's its main idea? To put all of those pieces together, to my mind, is a critical thinking skill set that develops in a communications type education. Am I off on that, or do you think that there's something to reading the space of a kitchen that helped you to be successful?
I think personally for me it would be a combination, but I do think it's like one thing I'll talk with the students that I work with is I think when you look at like someone who has been in an industry for 20, 25 years and where their knowledge is and where their comfort level is in what they're doing, it can be almost an intimidating thing when you're a young cook or you're someone that's in, like a college program and you're wondering, is this for me? Like, I don't know anything. There's so much to learn. And one thing I talk about is like, that's actually what makes it fun when you actually get involved into something, is that snowball keeps getting bigger. And then you actually, as you grasp things, as you grow in your career, you have opportunities to continue to grow that. And to me, I always use the example of something like, working in a cubicle where you're doing something you're not passionate about, and it might, pay your bills, it might pay your mortgage, but it's not really feeding, your creativity or your, self-being. So something like that is actually exciting, and you should like welcome that, that overwhelming feeling, because you're going to appreciate it down the line when you start, getting stagnant in things that you can always kind of pivot. You can, move in different directions.
I think that's great advice to your students. Do you remember when you were sort of, I'm picturing the that sort of overwhelming experience, almost like a wave, when you were sort of staring at the bottom of that wave of experiences crashing down on you in the early days of your cooking career. Did you like journal or record your thoughts? Do you remember writing things down, saying, with your ideas for food, or just your experiences?
I think like it is intimidating at that point. So I think you get to this point, you're like, I'm nowhere close to writing a menu. But you do start acknowledging, like, when you see certain new menu items or things that the chefs are making, like, oh, I really like that. Oh, I see what they're doing there. Oh, that's fun. Or, but at that point, I think for me, it was very much just in like, of trying to absorb what I could. When I did go to chef school, I went to Toronto to George Brown, and I worked in Toronto restaurants. And you're working with a lot of passionate cooks who've been there a little bit more, and then they're sharing some of their experiences. But I started reading not just cookbooks, but like books written by chefs, like Anthony Bourdain, very famous author, chef turned author. And someone gave me the book Kitchen Confidential when I worked at Jump in Toronto, and then from there, I read all his books, and then would read like Daniel Boulud was, wrote a book called Letters to a Young Chef, and the way they were able to relate to where you are and to where you're going, and like I'm talking about, like feeding that beast that is your, wanting to create that knowledge and passion and stuff like that, really I think helped me understand where I was in my career, and kind of put some focus onto where I'm at now. You're not trying to lead this kitchen, you're trying to absorb as much knowledge so that when it's your turn to lead a kitchen, you're more prepared for it and you know what to expect.
That sounds like it must have been a really exciting time. I can picture what it must have been like for you at that stage of your career and at that stage of your life to have had enough experience in the kitchen to have sort of gotten over that initial stage where you're almost blind and you don't have enough experience even yet to know what you don't know. But now you're sort of one stage in and you have a sense of what the future could be. And now you find these books and you find these voices, and they're opening up not just the like, as you said, not just the technical side of what your craft could be, but also connecting it to a whole world of experiences and emotions and ideas and people. That must have been a really exciting time of possibility and growth for you.
Yeah, no, it was absolutely like Toronto wasn't for me in the long term, but it was a great spot to sort of, kickstart that. And then working in that restaurant and, seeing some success being alongside some really good cooks and where I was and kind of getting to, it was a 2-year program of chef school. That was when I started saying, like, I'm not just doing this to kind of kick tires and figure out what I want to do. I think I would like actually be interested in pursuing this. And I could see myself staying in this industry, which is not where it started. I felt
Right.
like I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I didn't want to do nothing.
At that time, in your culinary training, was there any component of communication skill development? Was there any sense that the future they were preparing you for was, in addition to being inside the kitchen, that it was also a career that took place outside the kitchen in in bank in financial arrangements and marketing arrangements and business arrangements with other vendors?
Yeah. So at that age, they, again, like that is more when you get into a more management level.
Okay.
But for me personally, the culinary school aspect, I was very interested. Like they do teach you like food cost theory, like just even food theory in general, like where spices come from, the actual global impact that cooking has and where, how things like have moved across the world and changed how we cook and changed the ingredients we have available and stuff like that. Like I was fascinated by that. And that's sort of like that communication is just this global thing. So, you have international, like chefs are the same world around. So you have that, ability to kind of connect with each other when you are working in these environments. The actual flow of service is constant communication. And that's something I can't say enough is that there's
Right.
there's never a time where a kitchen should go silent.
Right.
That means the communication is broken down, right? So, it's a team game. So you have multiple people telling, okay, I've got 3 minutes on this, I've got 5 minutes on that, ordering new things. Like your constant communication with each other from the chef to the service team. And it's in real time.
So this is a point of the conversation that sort of resonates with a lot of the other conversations I have on this podcast with people from every other field imaginable, whether it's construction management or policing or nursing. I always am curious to know whether you think that the very applied form of communication that takes place in real time, often verbal, to what extent do you think your ability to communicate well and effectively in that space, to what extent do you think you're good at that because of the development that you had reading and writing in a more, conventional sense? Do you think you're better at communicating in real time effectively and efficiently because you were trained in that more traditional reading and writing space?
Definitely. I think that there's an ability to, when you're talking with that in real time communication, is to take pause and understand the difference between this is something that needs to be communicated now or later.
Right.
And then on a broader sense. So if you learn from something that would happen, like you use the example of a construction site or any trades where it's very practical,
Yeah.
Being a chef, ties right into that sort of thing. But then acknowledging at the end of service or at the end of a season, at the end of like when you're writing a new menu, realizing, okay, where did we get hiccups? Where did we get stitched up? Where are the challenges here? And then communicating to the entire team a strategy moving forward, be it with written memos, be it with staff meetings, be it with this constant engagement that is two-way, communication. It's not just, the chef directing everyone saying, here's what you do. At least that's not how I would operate things.
Yeah.
It's more of an involvement in the team. And then that communication, when you actually get to catch your breath and examine what you've been through, be it, like I said, one service or 1 month or an entire year,
Yeah.
You're going to use that communicating with each other to try and develop where you're going to kind of go next.
So I think this is a really interesting place in our conversation to pivot, because up until now, you've given us a great sense of what it might be like to be at the stage of a culinary career where a young person is sort of looking ahead, right? So somebody who has reached the stage where they've got their skill in trade honed, they've got that sort of first job, they've started to go through the reps of of cooking on a line in a kitchen day in and day out and doing their portion, and now starting to maybe get inspiration from the writings of professional chefs who might inspire them, who might give them a sense of the life that they're working towards. But just now, you started to give me a sense of all the work that goes into management of a restaurant, and I'm curious to know what you think might be perhaps surprising to young chefs or to people who are outside of the business altogether. Can you give us a sense of all the other things that go into running a restaurant or managing a restaurant that are perhaps a little bit more like that desk job than we might imagine when we're picturing The Bear or any other sort of cooking show or movie, and the excitement of the dinner rush is over. You mentioned a memo, you mentioned staff memo, you mentioned menu writing. Give us a sense of what else goes on behind the scenes when the chef takes off their whites and now they bust out their laptop.
Okay, yeah, that's a loaded question. I mean, because there is a lot. There is, because it is a people business. I think that it starts from being able to hire and recruit the right people that will help to see your vision, right? So, I mean, I talk about like different styles. I mean, sometimes, like you mentioned, The Bear, you see some chaos in the kitchen. I think that there's sometimes a negative connotation to that, and those kitchens do exist. For me personally, when I'm opening my restaurant, is like, how do I make sure that's not my kitchen?
Right.
That's not there's some cohesion between the front of house and back of the house, which can be two different teams trying to get one goal done. So easier said than done. And that can be, quite a dance to make sure that you have the right people there that see that vision and kind of understand. It really helps to have people that have kind of worked on both sides of the door in that regard. But further than that, like there's, to have a menu that's cohesive, and it's not even to just do a dish, but something that's like people get it. Like if people are going to come to your restaurant, they get what you're trying to do. They feel the vibe, everything from the top down. And I think that's what drew me to wanting to have my own business is if you are a chef of a restaurant, yes, get the menu. But for me personally, like being the chef of the steakhouse, that's a steakhouse menu.
Right.
So, like you're not going to get too far away from doing steaks and mashed potatoes and baked potatoes and prime rib. And you can change the rest of the menu till you're blue in the face, but 80% of it is going to be meat and potatoes.
Right.
I was the chef of the Italian restaurant the Charcoal Group does, and same thing. You want to kind of deviate and get real creative, but if it's not an Italian dish, you're hurting yourself more than you're helping yourself. So acknowledging those sorts of things, because you're the one that's responsible for communicating to your guests,
right?
What you're trying to do here. So being able to keep that vision kind of succinct and keep everyone on that track is a huge part of it.
It's amazing as I listen to you describe crafting a vision, how much it sounds to me like the work that we do in our communications area, sort of just below the surface. And again, how much it feels like what we aspire critical thinking to mean to our students in their different fields. So again, hearing you apply this kind of inner voice to your own work, asking yourself what is the situation, right? One of the fundamental concepts in our communications courses is the concept of rhetorical situation. Who's my audience and what's my purpose?
Mm-hmm.
And making communications choices from that original framework. I could use this set of vocabulary or that. I could use this, structure in how I organize my writing or present my writing, or another one. I have a million different sliders that I could toggle up or down, and neither side is right or wrong, but appropriate or less appropriate for this given situation.
Yeah.
And the sort of beginning stage is to have the ability to sort of operate at either side of that toggle switch. But then the next stage is to have the wherewithal to understand what's called for in the situation and why.
Mhm.
and to assess, okay, have I done that, right? And then also, as you said, starting to do that editing work as well. Okay, so here's my first sense of how I craft this menu, how I shape this experience for this restaurant. But now also let me step back and see, is it working? Where have I missed the mark a little bit? And that doesn't sound all that different to my ear than the kind of editing and revision that we might do with an essay or with an argumentative paragraph or anything that might be written on the page.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's got to be able to work together. It's got to be able to flow. If you're reading an essay and then, you start feeling like the writer of that essay is rambling, or they've kind of started like talking in circles, you can feel that. And as you're editing yourself through, you say, okay, I'm kind of going, this is getting redundant here. Let's get this a bit succinct. And I don't think menus are any different. I think, like if you were to be someone who's a meat eater and you don't ever eat, like lots of vegetables and stuff, that's fine for you personally. But if you're the chef of a restaurant, you're not catering to yourself. I talk a lot about, I've known chefs that can get frustrated with like vegan diners or something, which I think is hilarious, because if you're a business owner, you're turning away a huge chunk of business, and more as time goes on, do we have to be responsible for catering to the guests with whether they're dietary restrictions by choice, by allergies, by religion. You are catering to the guests, and they call it hospitality for a reason.
Right.
If you think it's, this is what we do, that is actually poor communication that you're sending out to your guests, is that, my tastes are more important, or, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So like one thing this will sound funny, but one thing I've heard chefs say for years and years is they say you eat with your eyes.
Right.
And when the food looks really, really nice right away, you're going to think, wow, this looks great. If someone puts something down in front of you and it looks really sloppy, your first impressions are, this isn't going to taste very good.
Right.
But one thing I've started to say, and it sounds funny, like I'll say again, is I say like you eat with your ears as well. So when you're reading a menu, if it sounds good and it's enticing, you're trying to communicate that to the guests. So you could have something that's delicious, but if it's not really communicated well, someone might get a dish in a restaurant and say, oh, it's not what I expected. Right. And that's a communication piece that the chef has missed the mark on how to describe what they're, offering on their menu. And people don't like surprises in a restaurant like that. They want to feel confident of what they're getting. So it's a funny piece there. And I try and put that into the perspective of young chefs as well, not to overwhelm, but to kind of keep things in perspective.
It's fascinating to think of a menu in the terms that you're describing here, almost as a kind of instructional document, right? That it's a kind of a roadmap to the diner, describing the experience they're about to have. It sounds like maybe I've underestimated menus in the past, that it's not just a shopping list or a list of options, but almost little doorways into the next hour and a half of my life, that and that it shapes that experience as well, that it's setting up expectations, it's creating sort of hopes or images in my head. It sounds like it's actually a really powerful document, and writing one effectively requires a great deal of skill and intentionality.
Yeah, there's definitely some strategy to all those sorts of things. Like certain diners will order certain types of things. Like I think for like my Red House menu, we'll usually have like one or two things on the menu that are specifically for adventurous diners.
Oh, wow.
Things like lamb's tongue, or, bone marrow and beef tartare, and a lot of like different things like that they are fairly commonplace in restaurants, but only certain types of diners will order them.
Right.
And some will totally shy away. Some people are never going to want to try oysters, no matter how many times you put it in front of them.
That's right.
But so you're going to want to have something that might be quote unquote meat and potatoes, something that's light pasta, or like a chicken breast, something that's going to be someone who's health conscious might lean towards, and so on and so forth down the list, and making sure you're kind of like hitting all those trigger points. Because like I said, I worked at the steakhouse before, and you'd have, I've heard chefs in there get frustrated if someone's asking for the vegan dish.
Right.
But it might be a family party with 10 people, and the person whose birthday it is loves the steakhouse, and the vegan is getting taken along. So it is our responsibility to make sure you are catering to everyone that is in there, and then everyone's going to really enjoy the experience. If you have 10 people, you have, all 10 of them are going to have something to choose.
It sounds like you've got a really strong sort of lay of the land. You understand the technical side of what's going on in the kitchen, sort of with the doors closed. But you've also got a strong understanding of who's coming into the restaurant and where they're coming from. Refer to some food trends that are more sort of recent, and business strategies or hospitality strategies that are contemporary. And so it makes me wonder, how do you stay connected with the changing culture? Are you continuing to read about food in the same way that you did when you were at George Brown and you were sort of getting opened up to the world? Are you reading food industry magazines or blogs? Are you going to other restaurants and looking at their menus with the same critical eye? How much are you continuing to sort of be a student of that field in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I touched on that earlier. Is I think that one thing that has made me stick with and appreciate being in culinary is that you never ever stop learning.
Right.
And now with both my roles, being both an entrepreneur who has my own business, and then now being expected to sort of lead the next wave of chefs.
Right.
It's of huge importance that I'm staying on trends. So to your point of going to other restaurants, it's not just seeing what's on their menu and following those trends. What are they charging? What's the vibe in here? What's the structure of the menu? Like, it's no longer always going to be appetizers, main course, and dessert. You go to some restaurants, it's all tapas, all small plates. It's okay. Here's how we order here. We do a family style here. Keeping in mind all those things for the extended success of my own business, but also to feel good about, leading where, when these young chefs look to me, like I did to my instructors 20 years ago, being able to give them good advice, sound advice that's current, and not just like, hey, this worked for me 20 years ago, you should try this.
Right.
It's sometimes even the opposite. I'll say like, this has changed. I talk a lot to my students about the excitement in the industry post-COVID because the industry has changed, and change, fosters opportunity. So these young chefs don't have to do things how I did them. There's all sorts of different ways that they can take them that I haven't even thought of. But again, that to me is an exciting thing, not an intimidating thing. I think it's kind of an opportunity for them.
So one of the things that we hope to do with this podcast is to help students, help young people, or I guess people of any age who are aspiring towards a new career in a particular field, to see communication skills as being a complementary component of their skill and trade. Right? Certainly not to suggest that it needs to take a sort of position of superiority over the skills and the knowledge they need to prepare this dish or prepare that dish, but that it's a vital addition and an essential component of what it means to be a successful practitioner in that field. In your recent work with the culinary students at Conestoga and as executive chef at Conestoga's Bloom restaurant, do you see a role for you in that position to try to sort of encourage that skill development as well? Is there space, do you think, maybe even more space from your position at the sort of executive level to try to encourage students to add that component to their skill set?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big proponent on that. I talk about the communication piece constantly. Like at my level, of course, like if I'm going to make a menu there, it's only going to be as good as it can be delivered by the chef instructors that are in those courses. And we have currently, there's 4 instructors that all are delivering the same menu that I'm creating.
Right.
So my challenge is to make sure that all these chefs, because it is an artistic trade, and everyone has their own different experiences. And I talk about there's not, one way to cook a chicken breast. There's not one way to cook a steak, to try and talk about that, this is how we're doing it for this menu, but you could do it X, Y, Z, allowing the instructors to communicate their own personal experiences and their own ideas of how to get the end product done, but also communicate that this specific menu was designed by this chef, and here's how we get to this result.
Right.
The consistency in any restaurant is really what shows the skill of the team and everything you're doing. So If you've got 5 chefs doing it 5 different ways,
Right.
we don't look very good in the end of the day. So, it's a huge piece there. And I talk about it, whether it's in personal relationships or friendships or business. Communication is so integral to how we, work and operate with each other because people are so different. So being able to kind of communicate where your end game is trying to be, why you thought of that in the first place, why you want to do this on the menu like that, helps people want to kind of, I don't want to say follow along with you, but to get on the same page with you.
Yeah.
And because you've been able to clearly, say it. And I think that that's a challenge that people should welcome, because I think it can be easy to say well, it's my menu and this is how I do it.
Right.
But just because it's your job and you're the quote unquote boss doesn't really necessarily mean people want to follow your lead. And then they actually might say, I'm going to do it my way anyways. But that communication piece is the best way to kind of foster teamwork and to, really help anyone understand what the end game is.
And we've been talking so much about the sort of culinary industry through the lens of the restaurant. But I'm also curious to know where you see the industry going, looking sort of ahead, specifically with social media technology sort of changing the landscape, with artificial intelligence technology entering the picture recently, with a huge sort of tech disruptors in the industry, food delivery services, and the like. What does it mean to be a culinary student today in 2024, looking ahead to a career in the food industry, and how do you think communication skills play into that changing landscape?
Yeah, so you touched on a couple of the big ones there, like how AI and social media will impact things. And I think, post-COVID, like I said, is going to be a very different world for a lot of different entrepreneurs and chefs alike. A lot of the strategy of trying to have a standalone restaurant like mine is to, I talked about identifying who your guests are and how to get them in the door, how to keep them coming back.
Yeah.
The way AI and some social media stuff is kind of tactically put together is that will find your guests because they will use data to analyze who's following you. There's ones that I've had people approach me trying to sell me data on, okay, so someone uses their Visa at Red House, that same person, shops at this clothing store, they shop at this grocery store.
Right.
How do I, market myself directly to those people? I'm of already an older wave. So to me, I'm that doesn't sound like anything I'm interested in, but for the next wave of chefs, you'd be foolish to not embrace all that, because that's really where things may go.
Yeah.
With what real estate is costing, what rents are costing. Right. You're seeing a new trend that was never really before. They'll call a ghost kitchen, where you have right. A common kitchen where someone can operate an Uber Eats restaurant that actually doesn't have a dining room.
Right.
They make this delicious food, but they don't have to, you're never buying chairs, you're never buying plateware, you're never buying glassware, you're not paying for your own hydro and all the gas and all these sorts of things. So the cost can be a little bit smaller. And then you're, using third-party apps and stuff like that.
Right.
Third-party apps don't necessarily work for a restaurant that's built in the traditional way. But they can work if you use that model, because you don't have all the overhead that I would have. Like I said, the things I touched on, some of the different, just the dining room itself is a huge cost. The service is a huge cost. So to be able to circumvent that and focus only on the food, that's just one of the trends that, is new in the post-COVID world.
And yet, even though from one sense you're focusing just on the food, you're also entering these business partnerships with several different companies and vendors, not just buying the food product that you're going to turn into your dishes that you're ultimately going to sell to the customer, but also the data and all these sort of user arrangements. It's a whole other form of literacy, I would imagine, to be able to understand the kinds of arrangements you're getting into and reading those contracts and negotiating them. And at the same time, there's a whole other sort of avenue of food professional that I'm imagining is kind of independent from the traditional food service model. I'm curious to know, after a whole generation of celebrity chefs and Food Network shows and cooking competition shows. Do you see your culinary students now starting to imagine themselves almost as independent brands more and more? Do you see the platform of interacting with customers being more and more a social media platform, people promoting themselves through Instagram, for example? Is that a skill set that you think aspiring food industry professionals need to have going forward? Can you imagine a course going forward in the future where that's a big part of their skill set?
No, of course. It's a very interesting thought. Like, I mean, I think, I've talked about like a good entrepreneur or a good leader could have a restaurant based on mediocre food, but a great chef who makes the best food, who can't communicate and can't, foster a team, their restaurant's not going to do very successful. If you're very charismatic and you want to talk to the camera and you have, an iPhone and a kitchen stove, you could start a cooking show based on your own skill set, making grilled cheese sandwiches specifically.
Right.
And if it's funny and if it's engaging and people follow your brand, you've got a business there.
Right.
So to be able to take that communication piece, like that's going way deeper than it's not, that's not specific to culinary. That's specific to where that whole industry is. And, whether that's all good or bad is a conversation for another day. I think that there's a lot of people that might focus a little too much on there. Or you hear the word influencer thrown around quite loosely. But it is very interesting because those who can make it work quite successfully with very little startup.
It's amazing to think about where the field may be headed, especially when you sort of put it in the context of where the industry was when you started. Probably a really dramatic span of growth and change. As we start to wrap up our conversation, do you have any sort of parting words of advice in terms of how you would encourage aspiring chefs, young professionals in the new professionals in the culinary industry? How can they approach reading and writing, communication skills in a way that can help them to grow and be successful in their careers?
Yeah, I mean, just based on even what we're just finishing off there, I think it's very, very important. Like, I think one thing that social media feeds and, all this things that you see is everything, people tend to want things very quicker.
Right.
You hear about, these life hacks, quote unquote, or shortcuts and this and that. One thing I would never discount is the making sure you take advantage of that time when you're young to absorb as much knowledge as you can. So the reading, the writing, like the reading of books, the working at the bottom is a good thing because it allows you to build those skills. Yeah. And if you try and skip steps, you'll actually hurt yourself long term. And the older you get, the harder it is to go back, right? You see people that want to go back to school and then they're like, well, now I've got my mortgage, I've got my family, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So when you're young, there is that, temptation to want to kind of shortcut. But personally, I would advise to try and balance that and make sure that you take advantage of that time to have fun and, really feed the knowledge piece first.
That sounds like terrific advice. Thanks so much, Dan, for being here and for sharing your experiences and your insights and your wisdom. It was great chatting with you.
Yeah, great. Thanks. It's been great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And that marks the end of another episode of Reading and Writing Between the Lines, a podcast hosted by me, John Witzman, on behalf of the Communications Department and School of Interdisciplinary Studies at Conestoga College. You can find other episodes of this series on our YouTube channel, Reading and Writing Between the Lines. Stay tuned for more episodes. Thanks for listening.